Hello and welcome to this video. This is going to be a different video than I usually make, being part of Project Windhorse. This being the third and final installment of this series. Within this video, I'll be going into the collective unconscious of Western civilization, focusing on the strongest currents within it, which I have mapped over the last year. Within my book Alchemy of the Psyche, I go into some of these currents and how they tie to both modern and various ancient manifestations of said psychic currents, linked to the archetypes of the sovereignty goddess Dionysus and Wotan with his choreos. The main purpose of this video is to reveal the goal of Project Windhorse, how this goal can be achieved, and ending the video with further resources on how you as a viewer can participate towards contributing to this goal. Now, you might wonder, what is this goal? To put it in simple terms, the goal of the project is to end the culture war. Now, one might be skeptical as to how such a thing would be possible, which I shall explain thoroughly within this video. However, before diving deeper into the video, I have to explain a few new terms that I coined as part of my ongoing research. These referring to psychic dams, trapped energy, and trans-archetypal pattern. Psychic dams being metaphorical barriers within the collective unconscious that prevent the free flow of psychological and cultural energy. And these dams can be formed by societal norms, historical traumas, unresolved conflicts, or rigid archetypal structures. Where trapped energy refers to the potential for growth, creativity, and healing that is hindered by these psychic dams. And this trapped energy often manifests as cultural tensions, individual psychological issues, and societal conflicts. And this is both energy trapped within the culture, but more importantly within individuals, referring to what Jung called psychic energy or libido, which at psychic dams are held up and channeled from the individual into goals that don't necessarily align with their best interest. Where a trans-archetypal pattern refers to a deeper level of analysis that goes beyond individual archetypes, such as characters or symbols, to explore the interconnected relationships between them across different cultural and historical contexts. For example, instead of studying a single mythological figure like Wotan in isolation, a trans-archetypal approach would examine how Wotan is connected to other figures and themes, such as the choreos pattern representing a masculine rite of passage, or his relationship with Dionysus and the sovereignty goddess from different mythologies. So rather than viewing archetypes in isolation, this approach emphasizes the broader patterns and themes that emerge when considering how archetypes interact and evolve over time and across cultures, to basically discover the larger underlying pattern that connects archetypes. Now, diving into the video itself. The map you're seeing shows the collective unconscious of Western civilization and the psychic currents between archetypes. Red arrows are the strongest trans-archetypal patterns that I identified over the last year that are relevant to the Scapegoat Complex, which I will go into a bit later. Though some of these trans-archetypal currents marked gray currently don't hold psychic water yet. These are held up with psychic dams and the collective, which are like acupuncture points, basically. Though of course, every individual is like a microcosm of the entire macrocosm I highlighted in this map. And there is also much more nuance and interconnection going on than I could display in the map. and as such it represents an oversimplification for the purpose of showing the strongest influences and current modern psychological flows within the culture. And this map, by the way, stems from my 332-page book Alchemy of the Psyche, about one of the trend archetypal patterns, and also a deep understanding of the interconnections between various archetypes from mythology, spanning all Indo-European cultures to the depth of Proto-Indo-European culture. So, tracing these patterns from modernity to the Neolithic to be able to make this map. Now, before I can delve deeper into the psychological currents themselves and also how these tie to modern movements, what is firstly most important is to explain the Scapegoat Complex itself, the various aspects and how this mechanism operates within both the individual and how this ties to the culture at large. So when it comes to this complex, it consists of the victim child, linked to scapegoat and wounded inner child, the wanderer, accuser, priest, and external and internal redeemer aspects. And together they make up what is called the Scapegoat Complex. So firstly, the victim child represents the aspect of the individual which is unfairly blamed or burdened with the problems and conflicts of others, like a scapegoat. And this aspect also then relates to the wounded inner child, which symbolizes unresolved emotional pain or trauma from past experiences, often stemming from childhood. Where next, the wanderer represents the individual's journey of feeling lost or disconnected, both physically and emotionally. And this aspect reflects a sense of aimlessness or searching for meaning and identity in life. And the wanderer is in that sense burdened with the collective guilt and chosen as the carrier of shadow impulses. And this aspect then also reflects the part of the individual that carries shadows, where the alienated and duty-bound persona tied to this wanderer aspect serves as a defense mechanism for the inner child. Very much is often engaged in people-pleasing dynamics and taking on the burdens of others to avoid rejection, where the accuser is the part of the individual that projects blame or responsibility to others for their own shortcomings or difficulties that they cannot acknowledge. And this aspect often involves projecting one's own insecurities, shadows, or faults onto others, leading to conflict and resentment. But in the modern complex, the accuser aspect can also become internalized, instead acting as an inner critic, which assumes the role of a condemning judge that demands absolute perfection and adherence to rigid norms. And this inner judge refuses to accept or acknowledge any impulse, creating thus a sort of rigid concrete block on desires which are repressed and seen as bad. And frequently, this aspect remains detached from awareness, concealed close to the inner child seeking acceptance. And the accuser aspect, resembling a harsh puritanical figure in its more extreme form, opposes the fulfillment of any need beyond basic survival, including dependency. And it labels such needs as selfish, needy, weak, and shameful, or classifies them as gluttonous behaviors that must not be acknowledged. But also consider how social media can also amplify the accuser aspect, where people quickly point fingers and blame others as well, which is another modern phenomena that can also be at play, which also ties into the priest aspect as well, which represents the embodiment of moral and societal norms, values, and expectations. And this aspect reflects the influence of cultural, religious, or societal institutions on an individual's sense of right and wrong, duty, and social conformity. It can also symbolize the internalized voice of authority or conscience that guides individuals' decisions and actions based on societal or moral standards. Which can also, does also stem from one's family and upbringing. But his role as priest can also cause the perpetuation of the scapegoat complex through judgment and the promise of redemption, which can perpetuate feelings of unworthiness and helplessness. Whereas the external redeemer is an external figure of force that is looked to for salvation or deliverance from suffering or adversity. And this aspect involves placing hope or reliance on someone or something outside of oneself to bring about resolution or salvation, leading to the reliance of external savior figures, which can lead to cult guru worship and other cult behavior in the hope to find salvation and belonging. However, this externalization does not lead to actual psychological or spiritual growth. Instead, the task of healing is to reconnect with one's internal redeemer, the self. And with that, I mean the Jungian self, the center of the psyche. And these aspects that I now explained are all present within each individual as much as that they represent certain aspects of the culture at large, not meaning that certain movements don't have any of the other aspects, more that certain aspects are more pronounced and strong as a driving force than the other aspects and archetypal energies that are present. And it are these strongest driving forces that are relevant to understand the main archetypal behavior that is being expressed through said modern movement. With this little ad, I also want to highlight that the Moment podcast now also has its own Substack. So if you're interested in reading more about various aspects such as the sovereignty goddess and things such as the anima, for instance, and various other interesting Jungian and mythological aspects and even spiritual aspects, I highly recommend checking out said Substack. Link in the description. In a way though, every movement contains everything which is shown here in the map of the collective unconscious. The only difference between groups and movements is the manner in which they relate to the various aspects in which ones they identified with and thus gravitate towards the strongest. So these different aspects and archetypes that you see within the map attract people that resonate with the psychic resonance of said aspects and archetypes. Thus, this creates movements and groups of people that flock around these parts of the collective psyche. Within the map that you see, the red currents are strong psychic currents that are tied to the Scapegoat Complex. The green ones are strong pagan currents that are active, where the purple ones are strong Christian currents that are active. The blue ones being less active within modern culture, where the white currents are less important currents for the culture when it comes to driving forces for the culture war, though important for the culture nonetheless. Where the gray ones are inactive currents that have a strong potential but reside within the collective shadow. Overall, this map shows both larger mythological archetypal forces and the less large standard archetypes. Next to aspects of the Scapegoat Complex and also a few archetypal patterns that are relevant linked to specific rituals and their linked archetypal pattern. Though this is of course a very Proto-Indo-European informed view of things, using that as the foundation. So one should keep that in mind. But as we can see, there are a lot of red strong currents flowing from the accuser aspect towards various archetypes, such as the sovereignty goddess, Pan, the three-headed serpent, smith god, crone, and the shadow, reflecting the historical and current tensions between Christianity and paganism that still underlies the modern ideological fractures within society, where feminism and social justice coalesce, for instance, strongest around the sovereignty goddess, where the manosphere, the pagan right and men's rights advocates, next to the mytho-poetic movement, coalesce strongest around Wotan and the Choreos, with the Christian right, for instance, coalescing the strongest around Yahweh, for obvious reasons, where the Jungians and different aspects of both left and right coalesce around Dionysus, making up the strongest camps within the culture war, where the current societal norms, historical collective, and personal traumas contribute to the formation of those unconsciously identified with the victim child, scapegoat, and wanderer aspects, where based on archetypal temperament of the individual, their social, cultural, and environmental circumstances, and their overall psychological makeup, they follow the current that leads them towards either the sovereignty goddess, Dionysus, or Wotan with his Choreos, to give some examples. And these being archetypal responses to the social, cultural, and environmental circumstances of the times we are living in, and means through those who carry personal trauma that touches upon these larger cultural and historical themes, try to find a sense of meaning for themselves. However, as the sovereignty goddess Dionysus and Wotan, with his Choreos, reside largely within the collective shadow, this often feeds into the scapegoat complex itself, thus leading to division and conflict between the movements that resonate and coalesce around these archetypal forces. And I also want to give some examples of groups that resonate with some of the archetypes mentioned. For instance, the sovereignty goddess archetype resonates the strongest with, for instance, social justice activists, but also gender-critical feminists and different types of feminists in general. Mainly due to the archetype's associations with justice and equality for all members of society, for instance, but also the advocacy for the rights and experiences of biological women, for instance, next to the general advocacy for women's rights and empowerment. Where another example would be the men's rights advocates, which might resonate with the Choreos wolf warrior archetype, symbolizing strength, independence, and resilience in the face of societal challenges and gender norms. Also being tied to the masculine rite of passage as well, where, for instance, the manosphere might, for instance, resonate with the wanderer archetype, and similarly the MGTOW movement as well. The latter especially prioritizing individual autonomy and seeking to disengage from societal expectations of masculinity, where the former is tied to exploring alternative narratives of masculinity. So currently, there are psychic dams present at the victim child, wanderer, sovereignty goddess, and Wotan with his Choreos, which keeps the psychic energy present within the current movements as they are. And said psychic dams cause the psychic energy to be trapped due to these aspects being both unconscious and in the collective shadow. Hence, this energy can't be properly utilized consciously for constructive purposes. Even though I do want to say that within these various movements, there are different actors, of course, that are very much busy with transforming these energies from the collective shadow and, indeed trying to use it in constructive manners. But this inability and this resistance that is present is partly due to a cultural tendency to avoid the shadow, and with it, the personal traumas of individuals. Hence, these traumas, both personal and collective, keep said psychic energy trapped, and these traumas also form psychological complexes. And these psychological complexes consist of unconscious mental patterns that are both personal and cultural in nature. And these complexes, formed through trauma, then create these behavior loops and patterns, which also ties into the neurological pathways and the nervous system, as they can trigger physiological and somatic effects, and with that, put one into fight, flight, or freeze. Basically, in both a personal and cultural sense, influencing our behaviors, emotions, thoughts, and even ways we perceive the world. And an important factor to keep in mind is that psychological complexes often thrive on chaos, conflict, stress, and overwhelm. And as such, they may hijack our thoughts and behaviors when we're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, leading us to act in ways that reinforce the complex's grip on us. And these complexes keep then also libido and with that psychic energy within individuals and on a larger scale within the culture blocked. Hence, trapping this energy and also reinforcing the cultural dynamics that we see. What is then thus key are the aspects such as the victim child, wanderer, and also the archetypes such as the sovereignty goddess, Dionysus, and Wotan with his choreos. These represent the current psychic dams, and by identifying such key points of influence within the collective unconscious, such as psychic dams and trans-archetypal currents they are connected to, we can use a strategy that prioritizes targeted interventions over broad-based efforts. So by strategically directing energy towards these critical nodes, it would be possible to create ripple effects that influence broader cultural dynamics with minimal resources and effort. So by focusing on areas where energy is most concentrated or where tensions are most pronounced, even modest interventions at these points could have cascading effects that reshape the cultural landscape. And this is the case because of the emergent properties of complex systems. By understanding and influencing underlying dynamics, one can catalyze larger scale transformations. And by leveraging the self-organizing principles of the collective unconscious, small perturbations at strategic points can lead to systemic changes that propagate throughout the culture, as these archetypes themselves become forces of change, which then leads to catalyzing cultural tipping points, where small changes in key variables lead to large-scale shifts in societal norms and behaviors. So by strategically activating these channels, it would be possible to tip the balance towards more positive and harmonious cultural narrative with relatively little effort. Mostly due to the fact that we would be targeting deep-seated issues and touching directly upon millennia-old archetypal currents. As such, these points are key nodes within the fractured mass of the culture war. So now coming back to the map. So, like I had said, the red arrows in the map represent strong currents within the collective unconscious, indicating powerful underlying psychological and cultural forces that influence the movements and archetypes I mapped. And these currents are deeper, often unconscious connections that drive the dynamics within the culture war. So understanding these currents can help in effectively addressing and transforming the scapegoat mechanism. So even if these underlying currents are not always visible on the surface, they do have a significant impact on the behaviors and ideologies of individuals and groups. And even if not all these currents carry water currently, they have the potential to become more influential. So recognizing and understanding them is key to anticipating and guiding cultural shifts. As such, understanding these triggers can help in activating positive transformations, and these transformations occur through narrative symbolism and the sharing of insights regarding the larger trans-archetypal pattern and the undistorted pattern this entails, which I go in depth into in my book Alchemy of the Psyche, where Further, crafting narratives that align with these strong currents can help in redirecting the collective energy towards more constructive outcomes. And this involves storytelling, media, and cultural expressions that resonate with these deep-seated forces, flipping them from their shadow manifestation towards positive forces. As we might be aware, certain feminist movements have embraced the witch archetype as a symbol of female power, resistance, and autonomy. And this embrace is partly a reclamation of a historically stigmatized figure and a challenge to patriarchal norms that demonize powerful women. And whilst embracing the witch can be empowering, it is also technically a partial and sometimes negative distortion of the sovereignty goddess archetype. As the focus on the witch, whilst it has for sure its positive sides, can also kind of lead into a cultural clash which can emphasize rebellion and otherness, potentially reinforcing the very stereotypes and marginalization it seeks to overcome. So in that way, the witch archetype could act as a cultural dam by confining the broader and more integrative aspects of the sovereignty goddess. And so this focus can then end up limiting the archetype's potential to foster a more inclusive and balanced vision of female authority and justice. So efforts to integrate the full spectrum of the sovereignty goddess archetype beyond just the witch aspect, which is part of her, can help balance the narrative. And this would involve acknowledging female authority and justice in ways that transcend rebellion and embrace broader roles. So to break down this dam, interventions I would feel should focus on reclaiming and reinterpreting the sovereignty goddess archetype in a more balanced and inclusive way, promoting narratives of female empowerment, leadership, and justice. Where the wanderer archetype, embodying the experience of exclusion and feeling like an outsider, is, for instance, to give a particular example, increasingly relevant in male movements and among those who feel marginalized or disconnected from mainstream society. And this obviously includes, much more than just male movements. And as such, it very much, includes individuals affected by economic changes, social isolation, or cultural displacement as well. And the stigmatization of these groups, often labeled as outcasts or rebels, acts as a dam. Movements advocating for men's rights, or those that appeal to men feeling marginalized by societal changes, often invoke Wotan's themes of strength and resistance. However, these movements can also fall into the trap of expressing their grievances through aggression and exclusionary practices. So to break down this dam, interventions could, for instance, focus on addressing the grievances of individuals who feel marginalized or disconnected from mainstream society. And this being the case, throughout the culture at large, beyond just the men's movement. And as such, promoting community building and a sense of belonging can help mitigate the influence of Shadow Wotan and counteract the divisive effects of, for instance, nationalist and exclusionary movements. Finally, the victim child archetype, embodying innocence and suffering, is prominently visible in various movements advocating for the rights of marginalized and persecuted groups. And to break down this dam, interventions could, for instance, focus on promoting narratives of empowerment, resilience, and healing among marginalized groups, and providing access to resources, support networks, and opportunities for self-advocacy can help individuals transition from a mindset of victimhood to one of empowerment and agency. Where this of course also ties into, the promoting of community building and sense of belonging that I talked about regarding, the Wotan Dam as well, but also obviously, ties into the sovereignty goddess as well. Then once these dams have been addressed and the flow of psychic energy has been unblocked, the next steps would involve channeling the energy into the now dormant grey currents. These being linked to the Archetypal ritual, the Choreos ritual, and Dionysus, where the Archetypal ritual is associated with the sovereignty goddess Archetype, symbolizing initiation, transformation, and the reclaiming of power. And by reconnecting with the sovereignty goddess Archetype through such types of rituals and practices that celebrate female empowerment, leadership, and justice, individuals could thus undergo a process of personal and collective transformation, where the Choreos ritual represents communal bonds, initiation rites, and the integration of the wanderer aspect. And by channeling the energy of the wanderer archetype through rituals and practices that promote belonging and shared purpose, individuals can forge strong communal bonds and overcome feelings of exclusion and alienation, where then Dionysus represents ecstasy, individual liberation, and the celebration of diversity. And by redirecting the psychic energy from the victim child archetype into rituals and practices that embrace diversity, creativity, and personal freedom, individuals can thus experience a sense of empowerment and collective joy. So by systematically addressing the dams present and strategically channeling the psychic energy into transformative rituals and practices, and also tapping into different narratives, using art and various means to tap into this kind of symbolism, it would thus be possible to initiate a process of cultural renewal and collective empowerment. Though, of course, other means for transformation could also be applied to address the underlying deep-seated issues, as long as the underlying archetypal current would be respected, and with that, the beliefs and cultural touchstones that they represent. Keeping in mind that the effectiveness of such interventions would depend on various factors, including cultural context, receptivity of the target audience, and the skillfulness of implementation. But going deeper into some of the different narratives that might be tied to these archetypal figures. Now, when it comes to the sovereignty goddess, the main narrative would potentially revolve around the idea of empowerment through unity. But all of this really boils down to promoting the idea that true sovereignty is achieved through a balance of individual empowerment and collective support. Where, when it comes to the victim child, the main narrative would potentially revolve around the idea of transformation through resilience, where the rituals or other practices are designed to empower individuals in a psychological manner, to cultivate an inner sense of resilience and strength, whilst also addressing the shadow and the wounds of the victim child, creating a space for healing and growth. In that sense, it does, look all complex and stuff, but really it boils down to the right container for self-healing. Through rituals and various practices, like with somatic practices, for instance, to create that inner container within, where then the archetypes of the sovereignty goddess, connected to the Archetypal, Dionysus, with those linked rituals and Wotan and the Choreos rituals, are basically older ways to bring forth the cultural containers for the process itself. Though really this happens within people, and it's really much about creating the container for empowerment, healing, and growth within the individual as much as, around the individual. And with these aspects addressed regarding the victim child, wanderer, and also the archetypes such as the sovereignty goddess Dionysus and Wotan, a slow move can be made to bring these elements together, And through this, one can then break the Scapegoat Complex, and also at the same time, the accuser, priest, and external redeemer aspects would be addressed. With the internal redeemer, symbolized here by Dionysus, and scapegoat, connected to the victim child, transcended, making that into a dual aspect of scapegoat redeemer, shadow and light as one. Where at the same time, the accuser and the external redeemer would be overcome through this move. There's also, with that, the priest aspect would be transcended. So then, one would be able to potentially unite large sections of both left and right, the non-extreme sections, under the new paradigm that this would thus create. Effectively, pulling people away from the extremes and towards a new cultural center, free from dogma or any form of top-down control. Where instead a decentralized mycelium network of choreospecs, for instance, how I envision it, or round tables, you can see it like that as well, or any other kind of decentralized network could be established, which at the same time would respect the free will and agency of the individual, which would have thus the potential for both individual, personal, and larger societal liberation. And through this inner shift that would be facilitated by breaking the Scapegoat Complex, we would also be effectively breaking the Scapegoat Complex within not just individuals, but the culture at large. And all of this that I've been talking about is also not just theoretical, it's also very much practical as well. I myself have gone through this journey of breaking the Scapegoat Complex. And within my video, The Alchemy of Self, from fragmentation to integration, I go into my own personal journey of addressing these very themes within myself that I'm talking about within this video. So, in that sense, I have already undergone this process and united the sovereignty goddess, Dionysus, and Wotan with his choreos within myself, thus healing the wanderer and victim child aspect, which is also why I know its effectiveness. Where this video itself outlines the larger possibilities of this shift happening within a larger scale context, which leads us to the following map that you can see here now, where now the orange currents represent the reactivation of the old channels that are currently still dormant, where now other aspects tied to the scapegoat dynamic could become dormant, so the gray ones. And really it's about rerouting the psychic energy into what then becomes the orange currents. We can do that by targeting the specific psychic dams and reroute thus the energy into these currents, which will break the Scapegoat Complex and will lead those currents to become inactive over time, though these old currents will remain present within the culture, of course. So by activating the current dormant channels, this will move the psychic energy that flows from the accuser and the shadow to victim child and other aspects away from that, thus depriving the channels that lead to division and conflict of their psychic waters, and breaking these psychic dams then further releases a significant amount of energy which can lead, if guided with care, to cascading positive effects through the culture, which thus amplifies the impact of the interventions, creating widespread change with relatively small initial actions. And as this approach further then also aligns with these powerful archetypal forces, this then also ensures that the changes are deeply rooted in the collective psyche. And it would help to free individuals from the constraints of rigid internalized cultural norms. So instead of feeling the pressure to have to adhere rigidly to it, one would be freed from this in an emotional and psychological sense, where through the bringing together of the victim child and internal redeemer, one can transcend ideas such as selfish versus selfless, shadow versus light, assertiveness versus compassion, death versus life. And with that, moving beyond weird ideas such as parts of us being deadwood or the burning off of what is weak. Instead, we can be empowering ourselves, heal ourselves, and nurture the parts that are vulnerable. And with that, nurture the wounds we carry. Which then cultivates both an awareness of the true driving factor within the shadow and also cultivating compassion for ourselves and others. So instead of the cultural narratives of duality, love and light only, perfection, a sense of eternal guilt for being, we move away from such things. Instead, we could move towards wholeness through compassion and kindness, strength, and inner worth. And as more individuals embrace this integrative approach and embody these principles in their lives, the cultural narrative shifts towards greater inclusivity, harmony, and collective evolution. So, by drawing individuals away from oppositional stances and towards a shared cultural narrative, this would effectively reduce the fuel for ideological conflicts, hence, over time, leading to the end of the culture war and establishing a new paradigm. Now, if you're interested in wanting to know more about the rituals and the trans-archetypal pattern, I recommend my book Alchemy of the Psyche, link in the description. And also for more practical ways to engage in this process, I also have the video The Alchemy of Self, from fragmentation to integration, and offer the new Corios mentoring program that goes deeper into the practical aspects on an individual level. And with this said, I hope that this video inspired you to reflect further on the ongoing divisions and also give pause to see the shared humanity of those involved.
Και κλειθελικό να βάθει δέντρονέλα και τε δύο σερібρομου θύγατρες